Today's guest probably needs no introduction to those paying attention to the social media space and to issues around democracy and polarization. Tristan Harris is the co-founder of the nonprofit the Center for Humane Technology, whose work was highlighted in the film The Social Dilemma, which was viewed over 100 million times. Tristan and I have become friends in the past year. I've introduced him to people in DC and elsewhere because I've concluded that without people understanding what's real, what is science, what is algorithm driven, if we can't have that conversation and discourse nationally, we will never be able to solve the longer term issues of climate change, resource depletion, financial overshoot, etc. As you'll see from our discussion, Tristan knows the intersection of society with our social media technology cold. It is my hope his organization and efforts can help pave a way to some healthier, more sustainable relationship between our social technology and our culture. I hope you find our conversation educational and helpful. Since I first met you last year, I think I need to call out your team's influence on our social media conversation. Obviously, my listeners probably know you made the movie The Social Dilemma, and with the Center of Humane Technology and Frances Haugen and presentations I'm sure you've given all over the world. For the first time last quarter, Facebook's daily user interactions declined. So that is kind of a David and Goliath story of sorts, that your education and evangelizing the risks of social media actually made a difference. So congratulations on that.
Well, Nate, I'm glad you mentioned that, because obviously they're wins for the whole of humanity to educate the world about why these systems are so toxic. But I just wanted to say it's actually worth mentioning, because I think some people might hear the problems we're going to talk about today and feel like it's just the most uphill climb in the world. I mean, how can you ever change $1 trillion market cap set of companies, each of them with $1 trillion market cap, business models that are entrenched?
No longer $1 trillion market cap. Now it's 500 billion.
That's right. And that's the point. If you had asked me, back in 2013, when we started working on the topics of the arms race for attention and, trying to raise awareness inside of Google and trying to get engineers and product managers to come forward and getting people to say we do have a fundamental misalignment of incentives, I would have never believed you in 2013 that we would be sitting in a place where Facebook's stock price would be cut in half by, since the releases by Frances Haugen, the brave whistleblower that came forward, who I know and who is a friend, that we would see people who say, I don't want to work at these toxic companies. I want to work at something else, right? I would have never believed you that, EU regulator Margarita Vestager would be using our language and the language of the social dilemma and crafting policy, that we would have a film that would reach 100 million people in 190 countries in 30 languages. So I know we're going to get into probably some dark topics today through the nature of the topic, but more has been changing than has ever changed in the space. And I think that's an important note to mark.
No, absolutely. So I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but when we met, we talked for a couple hours, if you recall, when we first met at a Starbucks. And then we talked another month later, and you said, Nate, since I met you, I haven't been sleeping that well because of the things we discussed: energy depletion, finance, climate change, the interconnected nature of everything. But something I've not shared with you is, after we met, I also started sleeping more poorly, because I realized that the things that you and your colleagues are working on, the information ecosystem, polarization, social media, what people believe versus what is reality, if we don't solve that, we can't solve the other things. And so we need to solve everything. But if people don't share a common understanding of what is going on in the real world, then I don't know what hope we have. So can you maybe, for the people that didn't the few people that didn't watch your documentary, can you just give us an umbrella overview of what's happening with our social media infrastructure, why it's getting worse, and why this is a critical risk? Just a few minute overview.
Sure. And also just to say, meeting you has been one of the most transformational experiences over the last year, I would say. I think I've sent your talks to so many people because it's so impacted how I'm thinking about the bigger risks that we face. And I just, anywhere I can go to recommend people watch your talks and read your work, I do, because I think it's just so fundamental. So right back at you.
Well, thank you for that. We'll pin that because I have a response to that, but keep going.
So let me give a little overview of The Social Dilemma for those who might not have seen it. So this film came out in September 2020, and it's a documentary made by the previous climate change film team, Chasing Ice, Chasing Coral, about the glaciers melting and then coral reefs bleaching. And so these are environmentalists who've been studying global impact problems for a long time. And it was an old friend of mine in college, Jeff Orlowski, who is the director of the film. The film is basically about tech insiders like myself. I used to be a design ethicist at Google. It has the guy who invented Facebook's business model, brought Facebook's business model of advertising to the company. Roger McNamee, who actually advised Zuckerberg in the early days. Renee DiResta, who was one of the few researchers who got the full Russia data set from 2016 and how they were influencing the US political sphere. Tech insiders who were inside of the companies, people from Pinterest, Snapchat, Instagram, et cetera. And they were coming forward to basically say, we have a problem. There is a fundamental misalignment of incentives between the business model of these companies, which is not just advertising, but it's the incentive to capture human attention. And we famously call this the race to the bottom of the brainstem to capture human attention, because you can be better at capturing human attention the deeper into our vices and into our fears and into our emotions and into our Paleolithic brain. The deeper you go, the more attention you'll get. And so what started off as just honestly offering products on a marketplace where I can choose this social network or that social network turns into this arms race for, can I stimulate your ego and narcissism and get you more reach and followers than the other guy can? And literally right now, Instagram and TikTok are kind of in an arms race for who can get you more viewers to that video, more likes, more followers, because that's how I inflate your ego and then get you coming back. And the more followers you have on my platform, the more likely you are to post your next video on my thing and not the other guy's thing. And so if I don't copy what you're doing, if you, for example, beautify photos, right? So there's these filters on these photo sharing apps. Snapchat has it, Instagram has it, TikTok has it. And when you take a photo or a selfie, the one that plumps your cheeks, that plumps your eyes, that plumps your lips the most and does the best, it's like mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And if you make me look best, then I'm probably going to post using your app. So just to give you an example of this arms race, it started off where each of them were competing to offer these different filters, right? Instagram has some filters, Snapchat has some filters, TikTok has some filters. But now it was found out that TikTok actually, without asking you, does the beautification by, I think it's like 2 to 3% or something like that. Because in that arms race, I'm going to do better if I automatically do it than if I wait for you to do it. And it's the same thing as with video sites, where I'm going to do better if I automatically autoplay the next video than if I don't automatically autoplay the next video. And if the other guy does it, then I have to too. If Netflix starts autoplaying the next episode, and YouTube has to start doing it too. And this is the arms race of a different kind of superorganism in your language that continues to grow, but it's feeding off the substrate of what makes our society work, because it preys on isolating us in that race for attention.
So just in the macro sense, the superorganism is a collective action problem because we want to use dollars that are spent on energy because that contributes to economic growth and salary and money, and other people are doing it. So to use less, we lose out versus other people unless we're really mature and have self-discipline. But you're saying that this same collective action problem happens in social media, where the best thing for me would be to not use filters and be authentic and honest. But if I make that choice, I'm outcompeted on whatever I'm trying to share by other people that do use these filters, et cetera.
Yeah, so there's two different arms races. There's an arms race on individuals. So, if some population of teen girls are not using the photo filters and some populations of teen girls are using the beautification filters, and the ones that are using beautification filters get access to more likes, more followers, more reshares, then suddenly it's going to be harder for the other ones not to, right? But that's on the user side. On the platform side, what I was talking about is the design. And that's really what our work at the Center for Humane Technology focuses on, is the design of Snapchat, Instagram, Discord, Facebook, etc. Because these are design choices made by people in Menlo Park, in Mountain View, in California. And their choices...
So the superorganism part is the design is optimized for clicks, which result in dollars.
That's right.
And the corollary is our economic system doesn't care about externalities. It doesn't care about the fact that we're mispricing this finite one-time bolus of fossil magic. It just cares about profits. So there's the analogy, yes? Exactly.
And just like there's a runaway growth imperative on an economy or a GDP of a country or an oil company that was directly tied to the financial system, and that causes climate change. Much of our stock market is propped up by the big 5 tech companies whose business models are well, not all of them, by the way, some of them, we should talk about the distinction. But for those who optimize for maximizing attention and engagement, they call it engagement. Their business model is making sure they get more time spent, more usage, and more engagement every year. And if it starts to go down, if they have to do and make choices that are about getting it to go back up. And that's the essence of our work, and what we've been saying is a massive problem and breaks the way that society works. Because to your original point, the deepest harm here, I think, is if you break shared reality, if you break the notion of our ability to see a same reality and have shared facts and shared understanding so we can coordinate what solutions we want. But in a business model of doing what's best for keeping you swiping, you, Nate Haugens, sitting there by yourself with your phone in your finger, I want you swiping the most. And so I'm going to show just not what makes everyone keep scrolling together to make that whole society work. I'm going to show what keeps Nate Haugen scrolling. And if that's doom scrolling on climate stuff and videos, on oil and debt, then I'm going to show him that. But if it's for your daughter who, might be swiping through anorexia videos because that tends to work best. And by the way, this is not deliberately done. What usually happens is someone starts swiping on dieting videos and food tips and healthy food. And then the algorithms are figuring out, well, what tends to work well for that cluster of users. And it turns out that the anorexia videos work really, really well. And the algorithms don't know what the word anorexia means. It doesn't know that those photos are good or bad. All it knows is that it works. And it's the same thing.
So that's important because we do kind of apply agency to these algorithms, thinking that they're evil and trying to show us things. They're just following mathematical algorithms that optimize for clicks. So there is not a hidden brain there choosing to lead us down the dark path.
That's right.
It's just optimizing what our own behaviors default click to, yes?
That's right. A lot of people want to vilify the tech companies and the founders of those companies and the people that work there. But I promise you, they're not all growing mustaches and twirling them as the world burns. They're instead caught in this arms race. Now, there are decisions that they can make, and they have been denying the fundamental reality that their products are causing these effects. And for that, we should be holding them accountable. I want to make sure I'm clear about that. There's definitely responsibility in the equation. But even if it weren't these set of founders, right, people have been very critical of Facebook, and because of our and collective efforts, people are using some of their products a lot less. But now people are moving to TikTok, and TikTok is doing just as much of the race to the bottom of the brainstem. It just crossed, I believe, YouTube and maybe Facebook in time spent on Android. So it's actually grown even more so. And that's because it's just a supercomputer pointed at your brain saying, what's the next video that's going to keep you swiping, instead of saying, maybe I should do something else. And that supercomputer is trained on, 2 billion users' behavior. It figures out exactly what's kept users just like you swiping. And so it knows way more than you know yourself what will work.
What we're saying then is that climate change and biodiversity loss and other natural resource sink effects are the externalities downstream of the macro superorganism, profit-seeking, market-dominated exponential growth system. And behaviors in especially teen women, polarization, addiction, lack of attention span to do gardening because you're addicted to online games or playing Overwatch or watching TikTok videos. Those are the externalities of the digital infrastructure that our culture has developed.
Yeah, that's right. I think that is the digital fallout, or what we used to call the climate change of culture. Because much like we have an extractive energy economy whose externality is climate change, and it occurs through what you've talked about, planetary overshoot, the over extraction, over pollution, over depletion, past the kind of metabolizing capacities of the earth in different ecosystems. We have to be specific about that. But in the same way, you can have certain amounts of personalization of content in society. But if you over-extract, if you do overshoot on personalization, you break the shared, what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls the epistemic commons, or the information ecology. These are fancy terms. We should just call it as our shared reality, our ability to make sense of the world together. And
when was the last time we had a shared reality?
Well, that's a great point, because we shouldn't do the classic Garden of Eden naturalistic fallacy thing where we say, hey, there was this pristine state of affairs where everybody viewed the world the same way. But we can talk about certain periods of history where in media, there was a smaller number of channels, and there was a cost to that. When we had Walter Cronkite, we didn't have an arms race on who could keep people's attention, and we didn't have 1,000 Walter Cronkites who started realizing that the best way to keep their attention was to be, Mr. Cronkite, QAnon extreme, and to pull people down into the Cronkite echo chamber that would keep people going.
We have tens of millions of Cronkites now. They all have their AM radio shows.
Yeah, but they're not Cronkites because their incentives have been to figure out, how do I inflame your emotions to keep you coming back? And if I tell you that you're right, that's going to work a lot better than saying, well, actually, that view you have, it's not that you're wrong. It's just that here's a more complex picture. The guy who's saying, well, here's nuance and complexity, they're going to get massively outcompeted by saying, here's a simple story and here's why you're right.
But what does that say about our genome, Homo sapiens, if we're more likely to click something that inflames us than informs us?
Well, I think is key to, I think, just about most of the guests you've had on your podcast, and to be consistent to sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, who kind of framed this as, I think this is how when you and I met, we both talked about all these concepts, that the fundamental problem of humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions and brains, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And our brains and our emotions, it's not that they're bad or they're wrong. They're just evolved for a different environment. And they were not, just like salt, sugar, and fat were not available on the savannah in the abundant quantities that they are today, and also not combined in this perfect, optimized way. Well, now we have the perfect optimized combinations of fear, amusement, ego, narcissism, and we're sort of combining those as the new salt, sugar, fat, but for society, delivered through digital tech products.
Right. So gossip and inflaming arguments about some hated out group, or some super great praise about my in group, or sex, or controversy, all those things shout louder to our brains than an objective accounting of the fact that fish are migrating northward because they need more oxygen because of warmer waters in the ocean. So this is a real example of why fitness matters more than truth. These things, at least we perceive in our brains that they matter more to our lives, even though they don't, relative to the ecological circumstances that are unfolding.
But as I say, we get caught in the drama treadmill, right? And so think about it, if I'm Twitter, right? So people use Twitter, and Twitter is like a drama internet. Every piece of drama is hyperlinked to every other piece of drama. So it's never been easier to see which drama inflamed in every other drama, and then go click down the rabbit hole and then see everyone's response to that drama. Drama is really good for Twitter because drama is engagement. And so they're trying to hyperlink all those things together because that makes them more successful as the sort of internet sinkhole of competing for attention. And all that's just to say that, again, their business models of capturing attention are fundamentally misaligned with a civic society that really works.
So here's another analog to the energy story. Our culture is energy blind in that we tend to be naive or ignore the massive benefits that we are getting from fossil hydrocarbons added to our system. we know that there are some bad things that happen with fossil fuels, pollution, climate change, et cetera. And yet we're not strong enough to stop using them. In the same way, we know, or we feel, that 6 hours of screen time a day, or I don't know what the average is per day. Mine was 6 hours on last Sunday. That's what my Apple said. We know that that's not good for us, yet we're not strong enough. Our Stone Age medieval minds aren't strong enough to go cold turkey on that. Now, part of that is maybe in the realm of addiction, and part of it is the collective action problems. If you or I, given our roles in trying to change the cultural conversation, were to totally give up social media, we would then be at a disadvantage of, promoting the message that we want to promote. But just speaking as a human, I'm pretty tired of Facebook, to be honest. I have a lot of my friends and family on there, and I like to post videos of my chickens. And by the way, the rooster Tristan got eaten by a coyote earlier this week.
Oh, no.
I named him after you when he was a chick. Yeah, so I'm the first time in 9 years I'm roosterless. As an aside, I need a replacement rooster. We're down to 15 hens.
Oh, no.
But anyways, I'm not strong enough to completely unsubscribe from all that. And it is useful to me because I need to pay attention to the information. But Facebook, I've almost completely given up on. I do post pictures of my dogs and my chickens, but beyond that, I don't use it much. But is that a reasonable analogy? We know we should give it up, but we can't.
I'm going to push back a little bit, actually, because oftentimes this gets classed as an addiction problem. And in fact, in Frances Haugen, when she came forward, she's the Facebook whistleblower, if people remember, and she said that in Facebook's own research, they know that parents give their kids bad advice, like just put the phone down, just don't use it, just use it for less, just don't use it after 10 p.m. What this misses in the picture is that Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever have colonized the basis of social participation in society. It's not an individual choice for me to not use it. If I'm a small, medium-sized business, do I have another place I can go to micro-target my ads to get the COVID economy rebooted after COVID? Right? I don't have another place to go.
You don't have a choice.
Right. If I'm a kid and all 12 of my closest friends are on Instagram, they're not on some other thing. They're on Instagram. So it's not about whether I'm scrolling. I have no choice. If I'm a politician and all of my competitors are advertising on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, do I have a choice about whether I try to match them in the arms race? And so just like to your point about the climate change thing and the oil companies, I'd say the analogy is closer to not just that it's just closest in the sense that to participate in society, for me to get on that plane to speak at the South by Southwest conference last week, I had to use the fossil hydrocarbon economy to get myself there.
They're exactly linked. We have downward causation caused by the financial markets that we are outsourcing our decisions to the market, to the financial system, and we're part of this culture. We can't live outside of it yet until there are options or a change. And it seems like that is another parallel with the social media infrastructure.
Yep. Well, so we have been on one phase of the energy infrastructure that, you can say that hydrocarbons were a great way of bootloading our society, hopefully into a different energy paradigm that would be more friendly to the environment. The attention economy based on advertising generated a bunch of wealth based on extracting human attention, treating us as the product, not the customer. And it got us to an era of prosperity, but now we need to switch to a new paradigm, just like we have to do with energy. And so I think they're very similar. In fact, of possible ways to talk about this issue, I've purposely tried to talk about it this way because I think it does double work at seeing the connection between economics, climate, and technology and the social climate. And just to say one last thing about the Paleolithic emotions, and that I'm a magician by trade as a background and as a kid.
I do know you're a magician.
Yeah.
I figured that out last week.
Yeah. Well, so, in seeing how these products are working, one of the things you have to realize is that they're designed with an asymmetry of knowledge. Just like a magician knows something about your mind and how you're going to make meaning of a situation, and they know they can manipulate that meaning making that you're doing. Technologists also have an asymmetry of information. They know something about what tends to be sticky for people, that they don't know about themselves. So like if I walk into Las Vegas in a casino, one of the things they figured out is if I remove the clock from the casino, people stay a lot longer because I'm essentially removing the reasons that as your mind is scanning around using its perceptual apparatus, it doesn't see clocks anywhere. You kind of forget, time just passes more in flow. And it turned out, someone actually pointed this out to me. I didn't realize it until a week ago. TikTok, if you open the app on an iPhone or an Android that doesn't have the notch with the uneven top, TikTok actually removes the clock as you're watching videos because they don't want you thinking about what time it is, right? And so these are the magician-like tricks on the human mind. And my co-founder, Aza Raskin from the Center for Humane Technology, he actually invented the infinite scroll, which is that instead of hitting next for a video or, clicking a button, that what if you just scroll and it just kept loading them at the bottom over and over and over again. And he invented that feature and he deeply regrets it. He estimates that it wastes several million lives per day in human time. And it's because they're removing the stopping cue, which is that cue that your mind needs in a conversation. Like if I stop talking right now and there's a space, we'll know that we can kind of switch turns. But if I keep talking and you're trying to jump in, then you won't be able to, right? So I'm doing the infinite scroll right now as I'm not letting you speak.
Well, in this particular case, I would probably eventually just butt in and speak.
Which is sometimes what our brains do when they catch up to realizing that we've been spending too long.
Right. Well, exactly. So a little bit on the magic, just to let you know, you and I were together a couple weeks ago. I can't remember exactly when it was 2 weeks ago. And you did this magic trick on me where you had this quarter in my hand and you said a story and my hand was closed and then the quarter was bent in half. And it wasn't before, and it was a real quarter, and I still have it. It's in the other room on my shelf. And I purposely don't believe that was actually magic. I purposefully did not look on the internet to see an explanation for that, because in the doing of that, I would have lost some of the specialness of you cracking up at watching my reaction and me wondering how the hell did he do that?
There's a key thing there, right? Which is that the magician, when they use the asymmetry of knowledge, that they know something about your mind that you don't know about themselves, they're not using that to take all your money or to manipulate your psychology and make you anorexic or to make you vote for a different candidate or to ruin a democracy that you're a part of. They use the asymmetry of information to create a magical experience, to create entertainment. In a way, they have a fiduciary obligation to you to be entertaining you. They're operating with that asymmetry of information to help or to entertain. But contrast to that, technology companies have way more knowledge about the vulnerabilities of your mind, way more privileged information. They also know a lot more how the technology works, but they're not using it to the best benefit of your children or to the democracy to function better.
So to use an obscure Dungeons and Dragons metaphor, the tech companies are lawful evil and magicians are chaotic good.
I actually haven't played that much Dungeons and Dragons, so you'd be educating me.
But my point is you can use magic in the broader sense to change people's perception of their reality. You do it all the time with your public talks, and you use word combinations for our prehistoric brain that change how people think and perhaps behave. But you're not doing that to generate clicks or money. You're doing that to change people's hearts and minds. So magic, in the sense of changing people's perception of reality, can be a real thing and a good thing. Yes?
Yeah. Well, I think there's this other trend that, if you think about a timeline of any intelligent species, if it gets to a sufficient level of intelligence, it starts to use its intelligence to understand itself. A lion doesn't have a capacity to point its own intelligence capacities to figure out how do lion brains work and then become self-aware of, man, why do I like gazelles? And why do I like gazelles that look like that and not this? They can't interrogate their own mind. What's unique about humans in our intelligence is that we can actually build tools and build instruments and then actually become self-aware. Well, first, we don't need tools. We can actually just do like what the Buddhists did, where we just sit with our minds and we can study how we really work. We can notice that we have something called loss aversion, that gaining $100 doesn't feel as good as not losing $100 feels bad. And that's for an evolutionary reason, but we can discover facts like that about the human mind. And that's what magicians have done, right? They've discovered these ancient facts about how minds make meaning and biases that we have. And you can think of a timeline that, from Edward Bernays and Sigmund Freud discovering some basic things about human minds, to developing marketing and focus groups, to then the magicians coming along and figuring out how magic works, and then figuring out Frank Luntz and Drew Weston and people like this who know how language can shape thoughts and minds. Then you can figure out the pickup artist community, and then cults, and then you can think about this increasing trajectory of self-knowledge about the predictability of human, social, animals' behavior if you control the environment and the situation. And that is like this sort of body of knowledge, which is how to turn the creativity and free will of human beings into predictable dead slabs of human behavior, because there's an asymmetry where you can cause things to happen.
This is why I lost sleep after I met you, because I realized that me, just college professor reality 101, trying to do a wide boundary, comprehensive library treatment of the human predicament on energy, human behavior, climate, biodiversity, money, economic growth, the future, isn't what you just described. It's relevant, but it's boring and dry and not going to be able to capture people with language, et cetera. So I really struggle with, should I just discard all the science other than what it informs in my head and use PR and tricks to change people's behavior? And that's not who I am. So I'm doing these educational videos and using some art and music and such. But it's really depressing to me that unless we change how people get information and have a discourse together in society, that these larger issues aren't going to be solved. Right?
Well, I think that we can make some distinctions that, this knowledge about how human minds work doesn't mean we can inform the people who are communicating the most important things to the world and then wrap around it this efficacy program, this to communicate even more powerfully things that people need to know. But of course, this ability to persuade minds, if you think about that's what it is, it's this ability to persuade minds. That's what's going up on a curve. And you can use that for good and for bad. Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster, famously used these focus groups to come up with phrases like death panels in the salesmanship of Obamacare, right? So instead of the Affordable Care Act is helping people, they're going to have death panels that are going to decide whether you're going to live or die, right? That was a powerful phrase.
Yeah. Yeah. And I disagree with him, and I don't know a lot about that issue, but just you framing it that way, I feel an aversion to whatever he was describing.
Right. But, he was finding, and that's what the point is, that these are values neutral. There's a values neutral capacity here that can be used for many different purposes. And he also discovered that the phrase climate change was less alarming than the phrase global warming, because the climate's always changing. And so it's a neutral statement. And it's this grand irony of history that the left in the United States ended up adopting, and the environmental movement ended up adopting the phrase climate change, which is one of the least effective phrases you could use.
Yeah, it's a euphemism. Where did that name come from? I don't even know. From Frank Luntz?
I don't believe that he invented it. And by the way, he regrets all this and has been trying to work to improve climate communication, and someone that I know, and he's actually been trying to do as much as he can to kind of help use the tools that he's had to help reverse polarization and reverse climate change and things like this. But, I think he didn't invent the phrase. I think he just discovered that it was the phrase that polled in the way that it did. But, across the board, I've studied this, and there's people like Nora Bateson, who we actually had on our podcast. We have a podcast called Your Undivided Attention, and we interviewed her about the power of language. And people don't know that, if you talk about a pre-owned car, people like the idea of buying a pre-owned car. But if you talk about a used car, no one wants a used car, right? And there's just all these games. George Lakoff at Berkeley will talk about this ad nauseum. He wrote a famous book called Metaphors We Live By, where if you frame the nation, for example, as a family, Mother Russia, we don't want those missiles in our backyard. We don't send our sons and daughters to war. In each of these phrases that I'm mentioning, we're invoking the nation as not just a nation. We're talking about the nation as a family member, as a parent, right? The backyard of our country, the mother Russia, the father Russia. These are all ways that we manipulate culture into believing in ideas like a nation, which are abstract. They're totally fictions.
Do all these language tricks or leanings that you just said have their core roots in evolutionary psychology that they're honing in on an impulse that was conserved over evolutionary time that was important to us?
Well, I mean, take that one, nation as a family, right? So the family is going to be pretty core in terms of the human experience. Over time, people are going to have mothers and fathers, and they tend to use the same basic ma for mother and da for father. Vaguely that direction, right? And then I think the clever political usage here is to link concepts that you want to be associated according to that childhood-like experience, that childhood-like loyalty and warmth that you get from a mother, to say Mother Russia. And when you link these things together, you can start constructing reality. Some people call it ontological design. But this is just giving people a taste. I mean, I think we can get more into the tech topics. Mm-hmm. The important thing to establish here is that the mind can be persuaded. Everyone is persuadable. It's not just that because you and I are here and our listeners are listening to this, that only us, three of us, that you, the listener, and the two of us, Nate and I, are the smart ones. And it's only those dumb people way over there that are manipulated by propaganda. You have to see that you're not ever not using language. You're always using language. And when you use language, you're casting spells that create a framework for seeing reality. And we just have to be aware of this, because increasingly there are actors that are better and better at knowing which language to use to get us to feel or believe one way or the other. And then you link this with the tech equation, and technology is getting better and better at reinforcing certain language patterns over and over again.
I just hired a coach to help me with various efforts with my organization. And one thing she said off the bat was that the language I use to describe our situation is too negative. And I say the problem. And instead, I should say the challenge or the opportunity. Mm-hmm. And the facts are all the same, but the language that I use tends to be too negative, because I'm freaking terrified about what's coming. So naturally, I have negative sounding words. But I think another issue that I learned recently is that if you're a certain personality type, or if you're a certain temperament, or if you're a certain Myers-Briggs type, the fact that other people think differently isn't the issue. The issue is that we naturally assume that other people think like we do, and that we're the same personality types. And
there's a name for that in psychology. I forgot the name right now. We overestimate the number of people who share our beliefs. And if you think about it, evolutionarily speaking, you would expect that people who you meet in your tribe are likely to vaguely have the same notion and construction of reality as us. And so we wouldn't evolutionarily be evolved to think about how different every reality would be for everyone else around us.
Right, because mostly 20 or 40 people around us, we pretty much kind of knew what was going on. And now there's so many different demographics that we come in contact with, and different personality types,
feeds. And so when you meet people and you say, oh my God, how they're showing up at January 6th, they must be insurrectionists or something like that. It's like, well, what if you've been fed a narrative for the last 10 years that showed that there was manipulation of the media, that people are not saying things that are true? And by the way, those are legitimate examples. I'm talking not just a conspiracy theory, but legitimate ways that the media has not been very honest about a whole bunch of things. And then someone says to you, the election, was rigged. And in so many ways, you can say that it kind of was rigged, and not actually rigged, but I mean the media environment, the questions that were asked to Trump or whatever. And then you say, hey, the election was stolen. If you genuinely believe that, and then you show up at the January 6th event, the other side now has been fed this whole news feed of the last 4 years that said that we're living in this authoritarian state for Trump or whatever. And these are the kind of fascist Trump followers who are, showing up at a rally. And so each of our perceptions of each other, I'm trying to say this in a way that's as sympathetic to at least the media environments that each have been living in. It causes us to be upset at each other, but from not even a shared ground, right? We don't have a shared understanding of even what history is or what narratives we're living in. And so we're constantly misinterpreting each other's behavior, which drives up itself more conflict.
Well, I want to get into that in a second, because I think polarization is one of our biggest risks that we face in the near term. But coming across your work, I had an interesting reaction. First was depression, that this was actually happening. The second was when I hear someone that's a January 6th conspiracy person, my initial reaction is frustration and anger. But after being exposed to yours and others' work in this space, I have developed more tolerance and empathy, because I understand that someone in my direct blood relative family who will remain unmentioned believes in that narrative. And now I can understand that it's their news feed. They only have one news feed, and they just don't get exposed to the things that you and I are talking about. So I have an understanding of why they come to that. So at least that's a mature direction for me to think about it, but it's still a giant
right. Well, and notice, by the way, that and I know this is a polarizing example, so I excuse myself hopefully with your listeners just to, for a moment, let's just cool off any emotions that might occur here. But, there were armed insurrectionists and people with zip ties who were going to take hostages and kill and harm, I think, people in our capital. So I just want to be very clear that I see that too. But if you're on the Trump supporter side, you saw infinite videos of very regular old Trump supporters who were just showing up at election day, believing that their election was stolen, and they're just showing up excited about Trump. They saw those videos. They didn't see the videos of the zip ties and the other stuff. Whereas on the left media ecosystem, you saw videos on a loop of all these guys with guns and slamming police officers and violence. And so again, when we're talking about this event, we've been seeing very different examples. On the Black Lives Matter side, if you're on one side of that, you clicked on a video of an innocent African-American person getting beaten by the police in a way that would make you just so outraged, right? And then you clicked on one of those and Twitter sees a pattern. It says, oh, I know what videos to serve people like you. And it shows you infinite videos of innocent African-Americans getting beaten by Black people. But if you're on the other side of that, you might click on a video of a police officer getting really unfairly treated. And then you see infinite videos of police officers getting really unfairly treated. And you start to realize that we've again been in these reinforcement loops of confirmation bias. And it's really fragmented in a very deep and subtle way our ability to ever even empathize with each other or where we're coming from.
And again, there's no billionaire behind that saying, hey, let's foment this, send those people these videos. This is just that algorithm uprating for drama and clicks, like you said.
That's right.
Earlier.
Although bad actors and foreign adversaries have been and will continue to amplify the narratives that they want. And so if I'm Russia, it's the best news in the world for me that this fault line emerged in your society around Black Lives Matter. So I'm going to dial up both sides, right? If you actually look at the behavior of the Russian bots, they're not pushing for one side. They're just pushing for what makes both sides angry. And they say things that people who are on each side would even agree with, right? They're not saying, it's not propaganda. It's what my colleague Renee DiResta calls amplifaganda, because they're just selecting what your own domestic voices in your country are saying, the most polarizing and divisive voices, and they're just piling onto those things. And so you can think of the newsfeed algorithm behind Facebook and Twitter and so on as a fault line finder. You've got $1 trillion of compute power that says, okay, whenever there's a fault line, because the fault lines emerge when people post an inflammatory content, and then it just puts an amplification loop on that fault line. And so it's like turning up the contrast in a photograph where all the lines suddenly get really visible, right? Suddenly all at once. That's what it's doing to our society. And we have to really see that at a fundamental level, because we have to see that it's incompatible with democracy. So I take a stronger view that when we talk about solutions to this problem, which I know you probably want to get into, that when we think about solutions, our lawmakers typically go to the legible ones. Like we have privacy reform and we have content liability, something called Section 230 reform. We have antitrust. These companies have gotten too big. It's too much concentrated power. But you take those three levers, privacy, content liability, and antitrust or concentrated power, and you don't get to a world where technology is strengthening democracy. You might get to a world where technology is maybe 10% less toxic for society than it is now. And I want to claim that our goal here in this conversation shouldn't be how do we reduce the harm of social media. We have to ask, what is technology plus democracy equals stronger democracy?
Is there anything on the horizon right now, technology-wise or regulation-wise, or anything that would dramatically improve or deteriorate the existing situation that you've outlined? Well,
there's all sorts of things that we can do and can be done. I just wanted to focus on, back to the E.O. Wilson quote, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and then accelerating godlike technology. The medieval institutions part is just that our law, the letter of the law, always lags the spirit of the law and the way that the spirit of law has to get reinterpreted in an increasingly complex world where technology is redefining our concepts. So we have a concept called protect freedom of speech, but that didn't anticipate a world where computers could generate speech and flood the internet with synthetic media of videos of things that didn't happen, of photos of fake bombings in Kharkiv and Ukraine, which it can do. And so what I was just trying to point out was that oftentimes our institutions reach for that which was legible in the concepts that it had articulated in the past, like consent or privacy or free speech. But what do those terms mean in a world where technology is changing the definition of what would privacy even mean when, for example, without you filling out a form and telling me your name and address and personality traits for Cambridge Analytica, there's a new paper out with AI that in 2018 with 70% accuracy, I can get your same big 5 personality traits, your openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, acceptance, I think I got that right, and neuroticism. And I can get those traits by looking at your mouse patterns, just by looking about how you move on a screen and click and the speed at which you click, you can read things. So think about it as like the end of the poker face, right? A regular person, they use their eyeballs and they're reading. It's like cold reading. It's another magician type thing. I can look at you and I can read certain things about you. A lot of that's kind of fake and they're manipulating how much they think they know. But increasingly technology is able to read our micro expressions and predict. There's another paper about that in 2018, I think, that AI can predict our micro expressions better than we know ourselves. And so I'm plotting this out because they challenge some of these things, these sacred cows that we've enshrined, like privacy, where the definition of privacy isn't whether a service collected, your name in a registration form. It's the ability for technology to know more things about us without even us filling in any explicit information.
Well, that was where I was going with the question are the developments that are coming with AI and GPT-3, machine language, and that in the coming years going to accelerate the trends that you're already describing on polarization and clicks and reading our minds and then directing political voting and market capture?
They do unless we take action and we realize what it'll take to lock some of this down, right? So even while I'm trying to be very clear also, I don't want to just scare people or cause a moral panic around the boogeyman of technology reading our face and micro expressions. It's not like every company is doing that. And Apple has control over Face ID and what people can and can't use Face ID for, right? And so on your iPhone, whether it reads those expressions or not, you have to give access for a phone to get access to your camera. So I just want to make sure I'm really clear that while these are capacities that are getting rolled out and they do challenge the situation, the key is that there are certain actors that we need to operate in our best interest. And if you think about it, Nate, like I often really like to think about this from the perspective of a doctor or a lawyer or a financial professional, because in all three of those fields, if I'm a doctor, I know way more about the complexity of medicine that you, the patient, don't know. And you're giving me privileged information, private information about you, so that I can hopefully make you make the best decision in that complexity. Right. So I have to be operating in your best interest, because if I use the fact that I know about medicine and you don't, I could just charge you for the, pharmaceuticals that make me the most money. And similarly, if I'm a financial professional, I know about finance more than you know about finance. And so you've got to trust that they're solving the principal agent problem of being a fiduciary to our best interests. And the same thing is true for a lawyer. They know about the law. And so in that divorce case, they need to be navigating for your best interest. So when you compare those fields and the amount of complexity that's on the other side, technology needs to act as a fiduciary to us in that complexity, because the complexity in technology is racing ahead faster and faster. Like I said, we have synthetic media, we have news feeds, we have different forms of privacy that we're going to need. We need to make sure, if you look at the first and second derivative of how fast those curves are going, the way to solve it isn't by regulating yesterday's misinformation problem from the 2016 election, which is where the regulation conversation is. The best way would be to pass something like the Tech Fiduciaries Act, which says that if you're above a certain size, you have to act with that complexity in the best interests of people. And we need better ways, democratic ways of defining what the best interests of people means. But we need to make sure that more and more of their decisions are not extractive. Because in that complexity, right now, you have Facebook operating for its best interests, which is whatever personalizes and outrages and inflames the most. And that's the same for Twitter and, similar for China and TikTok. And so that's what we need to change.
And do you have any existing examples of what that might look like, or conceptually, how might technology for the betterment of society as a regulatory thing look like?
It looks like technology being a sidekick for our values, for the 2 marshmallow version of us, not the 1 marshmallow version of us, right? And so that's the marshmallow test of, show you 1 marshmallow and can the kid resist it, and can they have an executive control ability in their neocortex that they can go for the 2 marshmallows 10 minutes from now instead of the 1 marshmallow now. And there's an ability to develop that capacity. But right now, technology wants to develop the 1 marshmallow society, as Daniel will often say.
But what if we're 80 to 90% of us are already the 1 marshmallow societies, and we're asking for more marshmallows? Do we need to train and educate and help meditate and mindful living as a precursor to these new technology laws? Do they need to happen hand in hand, or is it only a superorganism, top-down, downward causation sort of situation that the technology has to change, otherwise we're screwed?
You and I have talked about my executive director of the Center for Humane Technology, Randy Fernando, used to run. So we work on these problems of social media together. And he used to run a nonprofit called Mindful Schools that trained mindfulness to kids. And they would teach kids mindfulness for 10 minutes every day or something like that. They'd give the materials to train kids to teachers. And then they got this program into schools. And, so you get kids meditating, and it's great. And they could show the metrics showing it's making things better, whatever. The problem is when those same kids spend 5 hours more later that day on TikTok, it just completely undermines all of the work that you did on the meditation. And that's actually why Randy, joined us and working to do this, is we see the asymmetry of power. Let me give you a couple more examples of that. I don't mean to depress people, but there are philanthropists that spend $1 billion on depolarization efforts in the United States, where you put people into rooms with each other. And I think that's great. But the problem is that those same Americans who spend, let's say 10 hours in a room with other Americans, and they get a taste of the fact that, hey, people don't have nearly the same extreme views as I saw on social media. That's great. But then again, once I'm dosed with 5 hours a day of Twitter showing me the outrage machine and the other side acting in bad faith over and over and over again, because the bad faith examples of their behavior go more viral than the good faith examples of their behavior, then I'm going to believe the bad faith thing. So what's going to matter more, the $1 billion spent on depolarization or 5 hours a day on the tech platforms, which is to say the tech platforms are going to matter more? What's going to matter more? Teaching kids better mental health habits, meditation, mindfulness, feeling self-secure and confident about your body, all these things, or the 5 hours a day you spend on Instagram where I make you feel bad about your body. So the tech does have primacy. And that's the thing that people should have to get, is that this is the problem beneath other problems, because tech is gradually taking over the way that we see ourselves, our identity in the case of children, and the case that we see how we see ourselves in our democracy. And right now, just one last thing, Nate, I think it's really important for your listeners to know. There's this super important research by this group called More in Common. And what they studied was how we believe a stereotype of the other side, because social media rewards the most extreme views from the other side and presents those way more disproportionately than the moderate views, because we get hit by a double whammy. The extreme voices participate more often than moderate voices. And the extreme voices, when they say stuff, it goes more viral than a moderate person saying stuff. And so we get hit by a double whammy of overrepresentation of those extreme views. And just to make this concrete, Democrats believe that a third of Republicans make more than $250,000 a year, meaning are rich. Only 2% of Republicans make more than $250,000 a year. Republicans believe that more than a third of Democrats are LGBTQ. And only 6% of Democrats are LGBTQ. And if you ask both sides before the 2020 election, what percentage of the other side do you believe would justify violence before the election if they lost? And they believe that 50% of the other side would justify violence. But when you ask their own side, when they ask themselves, what was the actual number of that would justify violence? It was only 5%. So again, we're in a hall of mirrors of seeing the most extreme stuff. And even though I can tell you this, notice that your mind is still running the malware of the emotions of the last 10 years that reinforced a false view of who the other side is.
The natural landing spot for that, and we're almost there already, is the positive feedback on the extreme demographic, and the extreme message within that demographic is going to end up with a third of our society super far on the left with radical views, a third of society super far on the right with radical views, and a third of society, which is probably where I would be, which is just fed up and don't want to look at any more information ever again because they don't know what to trust. And in that world, how can we have a discourse about a collective future?
Exactly. We can't, which is why I say that, I think between you and Daniel and I, we've been just reiterating that our biggest problems in the world are all collective action problems or coordination problems. We're in a game theory matrix, and we need to figure out how to cooperate to achieve solutions and believe that the other side's not going to defect, which means we need to have a shared reality, whether we're talking about inequality or deforestation or poaching or, any of these problems, nuclear risk. We need to have a shared view of reality and then be able to coordinate around that reality. And that's why we need a social media infotech environment that's rewarding synthesis and creating those who are creating shared reality. So imagine instead of division entrepreneurs that are paid in more likes and followers, the more clever they are at finding divulsive fault lines, we get synthesis entrepreneurs. We reward synthesis entrepreneurs. And I don't mean we, the people, like we pay them where we like and follow their stuff more, but just like we subsidize corn or we subsidize the forms of energy we want to transition to, we could subsidize synthesis entrepreneurs, those who are doing that job and that work. And then other people say, well, who's successful on TikTok? Who's getting the most likes, followers, and rewards? And we'd say, oh, look, it's those synthesizers, not those dividers. And we want that society and we need that society. And the tech platforms need to get off the business model of profiting from the wrong thing so that we can do the right thing.
Is there any hope of that happening, or is that happening anywhere in the world right now? Are there little pilots?
There's a bunch of groups that are working on this. I think the best hope we have of this and the best living example of this is what's happening with Audrey Tang, who's the digital minister of Taiwan. I'd say that Taiwan is a unique example, not for what people know in terms of China being interested in taking over Taiwan, but Taiwan has actually pioneered a form of digital democracy where they actually sort in their online environment for what they call unlikely consensus. So they have this online polling system. Like we do our democracy using physical ballots and physical places that we gather and things like that. They're trying to ask the question, if we did democracy, not just trying to copy the old 18th century form of democracy online, but what if we did a new kind of democracy online where we have even more people than we could fit in the town hall, but we're searching for agreement. We're searching for where there's an unlikely consensus about what the problems are and what we want to do about them. And they built lots of technologies to help instrument that process. And their system called vTaiwan and Polis and GovZero, people can check out. We did an interview with Audrey Tang on our podcast called Your Undivided Attention that I really highly recommend because it's the most inspiring example. I think the podcast is called Digital Democracy is Within Reach. Because instead of a complaint about the tax system or climate change turning into a shitpost on Facebook that generates an outrage feed that then generates resignation and apathy, like you're saying, in their system, when I'm upset about something, I go to this online place and I talk about something I want to change. And instead of it turning into an outrage feed, they basically sort for who are the unlikely agreement participants in that process and then invite them into a Zoom call or a physical meeting where they are actually in a civic design process to talk about what, to get an expert input and then to actually talk about what they want to do about it. And it's like a machine.
It could be someone from the far left and the far right, or
That's
Taiwan's
right.
version of the same, but that they show some elements of facilitation or diplomacy or empathy or whatever, and those get uprated as opposed to the more flamboyant, extreme,
and
divisive
what they end
comments.
up with is, think of it like it's like an incentive. It's a landscape. It's an evolutionary search algorithm that's searching for legitimacy across party boundaries, across different points of view. And it finds these areas. And once it finds them, it sort of inflates them. Just like instead of doing narcissism inflation, they're doing synthesis inflation and finding how can we inflate the areas where people actually agree on something and want to do something. So when they get something like an 80% approval that, hey, this is what we want to do, the way she became digital minister is that the government in Taiwan saw that 80% of the public agreed that we should do X. And what are democracies looking for more than simply that there's just an overwhelming majority of people who want X? And right now, that's the thing that we really need. And that's the best example of it working in real time. And why the Biden administration doesn't invite Audrey Tang immediately to the US to help bootstrap a Manhattan Project for a US digital democracy right now is staggering to me.
Well, I think they're kind of busy with other problems, but to me, this seems like a real central problem. So I want to be sensitive to the time constraints here. I'm sure you and I could talk for 5 hours on this stuff, but I want to get back to when we first met. You also told me something else. You said that you had lost sleep after hearing about all the meta crisis and how things fit together. But you also said that you shared my video with some of your colleagues at your organization and your friends, and that in addition to feeling scared and depressed, you also simultaneously felt alive and this feeling of purpose and like community, that you were like seeing the map and it made sense and it energized you. And that really fired me up, because that's what I'm trying to do with all this work, is to get some fraction of society to roll up their sleeves and see what we face and work together. And it's the working together. I mean, you and I, we don't talk that often, but when we do, it's like a little shot of adrenaline, because you are a pro-social, adventurer and catalyst for better futures for humanity. And when I interact with you, I sense that, and I feel like there's a lot more people on the team. That's what we need to do, is grow that team somehow. But with the down-regulating of reality in social media, it seems difficult to do that. But building that community seems really important. Maybe you could talk about that just a bit.
Look, these are challenging topics, and what you said is true and real. I think we both faced it and felt it in our physical health. And I think, though, that there's nothing more powerful than seeing those problems together. I mean, ironically, that's what we're talking about with social media. Like, the ideal outcome is that we're able to synthesize and find common ground about what we actually are all seeing together, as opposed to some people are upset about a cabal of pedophile elite, and some people are upset about Fauci, and some people are upset about Biden, and some people are upset about Trump, and everyone's just in this different reality, upset about different things. It's really hard to feel purpose when that division exists. And what I love about your work is it's about, you can't have a society be energy blind if it depends on energy. If just like you can't have an economy be blind to the biosphere if it depends on the biosphere. And so I think that what's so important about your work is it's foundational to the life support systems that give rise to our ability to do everything else. And similarly, I think our work at the Center for Humane Technology is foundational to the social fabric that we need, the sort of social trust, social contract that we need to be able to do all the other problems. Now, that's daunting when you realize that both are in such a dire predicament. But when you find the others, as Jamie Wheal likes to say, of people who are seeing the same system that you are. And I think one of the challenges, I listened to your podcast, Nate, and it's excellent. It's wonderful. And it's such important work that you're doing here. And I know that if I'm another listener that I'm speaking to right now, it can often feel like you're alone when you're a listener listening to these things. And I think the strongest thing you can do is find community who see this problem with you. Because when you know that other people are working on different aspects, it gives you some hope. I think Daniel and you and I meeting together this year has been some of the most inspiring jolts of inspiration and energy to keep working on this stuff, because we know that there's an invisible team of allies that are kind of doing the best that we can, at least to navigate, right? We're not going to be able to quote unquote solve or fix all of this. It's just, how do we mitigate and navigate and make wise choices no matter what happens.
I agree with you. And I think I'm trying to come up with a list of interventions at the global, national, community level. At the individual level, there's no easy answers here. And I think telling people or suggesting people how to be instead of what to do is probably what I'm going to do for this year's Earth Day talk. Because we just need a lot more people speaking the same language, knowing that they're not alone. And the key, I think, is there are so many people who know that something is wrong with our trajectory. I call them the walking worried. And we need to get those people connected and talking to each other in Topeka, Kansas, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Mendocino, California, et cetera. And even if it's a small group, you form the social bonds now when things are relatively stable and peaceful and relatively. And those social networks are going to be really important no matter what happens in the future. And this coming back to your work again with the social media, the distraction of it, because people spend so much time in their little castles ordering stuff from Amazon and getting their dopamine and entertainment on various social media and other things. That's part of it. The other part is the forming of the little viral mimetic tribes that we've splintered away from the natural physical tribes in our communities where we live. And I think that needs to be reversed. It's going to be reversed because we're going to need those people again in our lives. I want to accelerate it if possible.
It's like your friend Nora Bateson, who, when your podcast said that her friend was starting laundromats or something like that in small cities, I think I heard her say, because laundromats are little micro community gathering points, right? And we have hollowed out the social fabric because as the Amazonification and DoorDashification and seamlessification of the world, one click and you're at my door and I get to live more and more in my own physical isolated reality comes true, it undermines those shared places and hollows out those shared places of physical gathering. And we are Paleolithic social animal beings, and we need that. And one of the things that Jamie Wheal does with his Recapture the Rapture gatherings is how do we just bring people together to do the human things, the dancing, the music, the just the being with each other. And by the way, this doesn't have to be this way. Like if Facebook's business model was bringing people together, they could be just dialing up the events sort of coordination system so that it's never been easier to have a rich community life. You can imagine a version of social media that's actually all about making social coordination of being in the physical world together easier. But of course, so long as the business model.
Why doesn't that spontaneously evolve somewhere as an alternative? And then there's PR to advertise to send people there. And that's what's uprated. Why isn't that happening? There's got to be some barrier that keeps that from happening.
Them from doing it, the current incumbent platforms, is that their business models are based on attention. So the hiking trips and the shared ecstatic dance experiences and the book clubs in person, those don't make them money. And the isolated screen time, watching stuff, laughing stuff by yourself does make them money. So that's why we need to have another platform. I mean, Apple is one of the best positioned companies to address these problems, by the way, because their business model is the hardware. And, they already have a feature called Find My Friends or Find My, and you can add your friends on there. And maybe we should do that. So I know more when you're in town. And, it could be
we did that 2 weeks ago.
I think that's right.
On that hiking
exactly.
trail.
But imagine that kind of feature set was built out by Apple, again, whose business model is totally friendly to the things that we've talked about. And they could say, hey, instead of just a static map that you can just see where your friends are in real time, what if they had ways of signaling where we're going to be, which friends we're open to seeing, ways of making scheduling and calendaring a little bit smoother. Like there are ways of strengthening that possibility. And there, by the way, there should be smaller actors and startups and things like that, but there are technical and psychological reasons for why it's hard for small startups to do it. So Apple's just one of the viable actors that can kind of move the whole thing in this direction.
Well, that gives me hope. And I do think that going out there and alerting people to the risks from social media or from climate change or resource depletion, et cetera, is necessary as well, so that they kind of know we need to do it a different way. So keep doing what you're doing, and good luck with all your successes on Center for Humane Technology. So Tristan, due to the time, I have some closing questions that I ask all my guests, a little bit more on the personal side. Okay. So I hope you're okay answering them. But given everything that you just outlined, what kind of advice would you give to people, especially young people who today understand your story and maybe my story, that they're alive during this time of a fractured information system and this giant panoply of risks, the meta crisis, the human predicament? What sort of advice would you give to a young person?
First, I empathize with when you see things like this, it can be really hard, and taking it in on your own is not advised. I think the key thing we've already talked about is having community. But like you've already said, Nate, like the best things in life are free. I find that in this period of COVID and knowing the things I know, the things I get the most pleasure from is having dinner with a small group of friends. It's just like the film Don't Look Up, right? It's like the asteroid's coming to hit Earth. And what do people do? What do they do the last night before the asteroid, is hitting Earth? Is they're bringing some food and wine over, and they're hanging out. And I think that our ability to be resilient, no matter what, more volatility and chaos is coming our way, and there's going to be more volatility. I think that it's about going through it together. That was actually a powerful thing a friend said to me recently over the summer, and kind of reckoning with these topics is like, yep, it's going to get a little bit bumpy. And the key thing is that we're going to go through that bumpiness together. And there's just something about not just those words, but actually feeling it. Like if you feel like you have that community, it doesn't mean hide in your hole. It means just build resilience with the people around you that, you want to navigate this whole thing with, and find the others who see it in similar ways so that we can all make wiser choices together.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I try to, and when I bike where I bike, and finally it's spring, so I'm biking again. Every bike ride I go in this county, this rural county I live in, I try and stop and say hello to someone that I've never met before who's out working in their yard, because these are the people that live in my county, and I know very few of them. So I agree with you on the community. So next question, Tristan, personal question. And I don't know how you're going to answer this. What do you care most about in the world?
These are deep questions. I don't know if I care most about one thing. I think, having a good future, as best a future as we can have, is, I think, every day I wake up and I just ask every moment of my life, what am I doing? What's the most leveraged thing that I can do to enable us to have a better future than the one that we're currently on the trajectory on. And, there are things that are moving in that direction. Like it's actually interesting. If we can survive this Ukraine-Russia situation, and it's been awful, obviously, for everyone in Ukraine, and I just want to completely honor that. The social media issues have really weakened democracies everywhere. They've weakened shared reality. They've made it hard to come together. But this Ukraine situation has actually kind of activated democracies more than ever into more coherence, to drop a lot of their local inside differences and fault lines, and to instead focus on a more shared threat, which is really, I think, viewing the monster that is the authoritarian thing that happens when you have a small, one person at the top of a massive thing that has a lot of power, a lot of economic resources, nuclear weapons, and is acting in a unilateral way and can be inside of the bubble and echo chamber of their own mind. And that's true of Xi Jinping. That's true of Putin. And we're seeing how that form of governance can act in a way that it doesn't have checks and balances against it. And I think that if we can make it through this, is an interesting development at reversing a lot of the trends that we've talked about. Because on the one hand, I'd love to see social media platforms that, reward the synthesis entrepreneurs and those who are better at bringing us together. And I want to see that. I think that these external events could, be used to flip things the other way. And I go back to I think it's a Taoist story of the Zen maybe. The maybe. So let me say it again. I go back to this Taoist story of the farmer. I think it's called the maybe story. Are you familiar with this one, Nate? It's no. It's sort of a series of stories where the farmer's son breaks his leg, and the person comes over to the farmer and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry that this tragedy, fell upon your son." And he says, "Don't you feel bad about that?" And the farmer says, "Maybe." The next moment, a week later, there's a war breaks out, and all of the sons have to go into the war. But then his son who broke his leg doesn't have to go. And then the person comes up to him and says, "Aren't you glad your son didn't have to go to the war?" And he says, maybe. And it keeps flipping back and forth, the meaning of each event. Oh, it's the worst thing that ever happened. Oh, that's the best thing that ever happened. And I just think that story provides a lot of calm to the situation, because you realize uncertainty is the place from which not a kind of hey, it's all going to work out okay. But that's if hope lives anywhere, it's in the things that we don't know, because in the places of certainty, it's not going to be there.
We like certainty, and that's one of the pieces of advice I give my students, is to embrace uncertainty. It doesn't feel good, but we're going to have to get more familiar with it. So given that maybe Zen story, two other questions for you that are bookends. What are you most worried about in the coming decade, and what are you most hopeful about in the coming decade?
Most worried about is all of the things we've discussed. I mean, maybe I'm too close to the problem that I'm focused on, but what I worry about is how hard it is to reverse people out of very deep entrenched belief systems on any side, right? It's much easier to pull someone into a cult than to get them out. Ask anybody who's been in a cult. Yeah. And it's really hard once we've bound our identities up with something to let go of that, because it is controlled and taken over our identities and our relationships. And one of the ways that cults prey on people, I actually studied cults in my work on persuasive technology. And one of the ways that cults prey on people is that they increase the price tag of leaving, because they tell everybody who your relationships in the cult that they're going to disconnect from you completely if you leave. And they suck in your family. So if you leave the cult, you're going to leave your family, and then also the family that is in the cult. And their manipulative design imperative is to increase that price tag. So it's much, much harder to leave. And that's invisibly and implicitly happening with the way that social media kind of isolates us more and more into these bubbles, where it's really hard, no matter what extreme perspective we've been pulled into, to sort of say, well, I'm willing to let go of some of that a little bit. So what worries me is that it's much harder to hit the reverse than it is to hit the gas. And that's also why, for so long we were really trying to scream as loud as we could upstream from these problems so that we could get ahead of it. Unfortunately, we've gone pretty deep into the cult factory. But the thing that gives me hope, maybe to turn to your second question, is just that I would never have seen as much change that has in fact happened as over the last even 6 months. If you had told me that the president of the United States would be, during a State of the Union address, asking someone who was whistleblowing about this fundamental problem, stand up at the State of the Union, which is what Biden did just recently, and inviting Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, giving this national attention and saying this is a shared problem for our democracy, to go from something that a handful of people inside of tech companies know is a problem and are clamoring about, to something that has, the most esteemed elite attention in the world. I think we've totally traversed that. And the stock prices of these companies have dropped tremendously. We're seeing attorney generals file big tobacco style lawsuits and litigation that's increasing the risk. So future investors don't want to fund more products like this that are in the race to the bottom of the brainstem. Apple is making small changes in this direction. There's a lot to be proud of in the amount that is changing in the other way. We're not there yet, but I think it's important to, if you had a Geiger counter that's sort of like a clicker for each click on the timeline of things moving in a better direction, it would sound like, click, click, and then, and it's getting faster and faster. So that's where I at least, get hope from, and hopefully people waking up and listening more to your podcast and seeing these problems.
Thank you. I think my podcast is just trying to outline how all the different issues interconnect, and most people in climate, energy, finance space don't get your perspective. I think they've probably seen your documentary and are a little aware of this, but this issue affects everything. So I really wish you luck and continued success on this. And we'll have to have you back in 6 months or so and get an update, because there's so much more that I want to talk to you about. Do you have any other closing words of wisdom, advice, or thoughts for our listeners?
No, I don't. I think that I can barely say something wise about the things that you asked me before. So I just appreciate being on with you, Nate. It's really great to do this with you.
Final honest question. Should I unsubscribe from social media?
I would say that if you don't need these things, then get off. The problem is that we justify to ourselves, oh, but what if I were to miss, and there it is again, the loss aversion, there's that Paleolithic emotion. But what if I were to miss that video, that one video of, that would change my view on this topic? And we would miss things, but we're missing things all the time. And I'll tell you maybe one last story. Steve Jobs was once asked when someone who was building the podcast app for the iPhone, probably the one that you're listening to this podcast on right now. The guy who was building this podcast app was in a meeting with Steve Jobs at Apple and said, I have an idea. Why don't we make a news feed that shows you what all the podcasts your friends are listening to? So I would see when Nate's listening to his podcast and he'd see what things I'm listening to, and we'd be able to see each other's stuff. And then we can create a different kind of social network around it. And Steve Jobs sort of like slammed his fist on the table and said, no. He said, if something is actually that important, then your friend will copy and paste it, the link to it, and they'll send it to you. And we've gotten sort of normalized to this view that everything has to be shared with us and go viral and put it in a feed and all of this stuff. I would prefer to live in a society of what's time well spent or sort of worthy of our lives and our finite time and attention, given the challenges that we face. And I think that if we develop a social norm and a culture where when things are really important, we take the time to send it to those handful of people that need to know about it. Because if we knew that was the decentralized operating system running inside of everybody else, then we could have a lot more faith, not worrying that we're going to miss something important from these feeds.
Well, on that note, I am going to bid you a good afternoon. I'm going to change my clothes. I'm going to get on my bike. It's 48 degrees out. And because of the pro-social shot of camaraderie, I'm going to leave my phone here on my hour bike ride, and I'm going to check how many likes I
got for this podcast to see if people are still giving me.
Thanks.
Okay.
All right, my friend. To be continued. Be well. I'll talk to you soon, and thanks for your time. If you enjoyed or learned from this episode of The Great Simplification, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform and visit thegreatsimplification.com for more information on future releases.